And we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to day 2 of the Ubuntu Online Summit. We got a whole bunch of great sessions lined up for you today, and the first one in the morning. I've been really looking forward to this. And this is going to be modeling Docker containers with Juju. Now, this is containers, Docker, LXD. Containers in general have been kind of taking the world by storm. They have been around for a while, but now everyone can't stop talking about containers. So we wanted to have, I asked Whit here to put together a session that would kind of, first of all, outline where we're going as far as taking all the good stuff that's available out there in Docker and being able to consume that with Juju in a way that's repeatable and deployable. Because when I see these cool Docker containers, I want to take those and I want to shove them onto hardware or my favorite cloud, and I want to do that easily, just like I do any other workload. But before we begin, Whit, who are you? What's this team? You guys are called the New Workloads team. I don't know what that means. So kind of tell me, like, as a normal Ubuntu user, what are you three guys doing for me if I'm a normal Ubuntu server user?
So our team, our primary function is to go out and sort of look at and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening with the container space in general. We've got a lot of stuff going on. There have been some changes. But basically, sort of with the beginning, even before Docker, but Docker kind of was something that brought it to the public forefront. There's sort of been this huge explosion of innovation in the space. Lots of open source projects, a lot of small ISVs and growing ISVs growing up around this, and then bigger players too, such as Docker Incorporated itself and Google, and you see other people like VMware getting into this with Phoronix, or not with Phoronix, with Photon. So we have, our job is basically to go out there and look at all the things that are happening and try to figure out which are the things that we can most sensibly bring into Juju and the ways that we can get Juju to connect with those. So you can actually deploy these things, you can try them out, you can basically analyze which ones work for your use cases, and Juju gives you an excellent way to do this. So we are writing charms, and we are also trying to engage with people out there in the community to get them writing charms, because there's a lot going on. We can't all do it ourselves, and we don't know all the problem spaces like the people who are working on them directly. So with me here is Charles Butler, aka Lazy Power, and Matt Bruzek. And the three of us have been, the big thing that we've been working on in the past quarter has been Kubernetes, which we'll talk a little bit about. We've also got a very nice base charm and charm ecosystem around Docker itself. And this actually, we have just recently, this has actually become, we've done this in such a way that you can actually use all the goodness in that Docker charm and then also build Kubernetes on top of that, or Swarm on top of that. And we're working towards actually building out sort of more of a like do-it-yourself stack for people who need something a little more lighter, want to have more knobs, more control. So that's kind of what we're working on. We'll try to drop some links in the channel about sort of where you can check in on our planning activities. We've got sort of an open planning site that we're starting in GitHub, which actually let me drop that. Well, I'll drop that link in a second. But where you guys can kind of come, tell us what you're looking for, what you're interested in, and we can also let you know where to go download the source for these charms and work on them. But that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Okay, so you basically have two parts that you're going to show us. Basically, the Docker charm, and then I do want to spend some time talking about Kubernetes as well, because that's like a sexy thing that everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure our users know that you guys are delivering the absolute best Kubernetes experience when we get there. So who's going first? How do you want to run this? I would just like to mute and wow me.
Yeah. Dazzle you with amazing things happening. I think probably we should sort of talk about the landscape first. So
okay.
I think Docker just had its 2-year birthday, and I feel like it sort of kind of hit its stride about a year and a half ago. and there's just sort of an explosion of all these open source projects. Everybody got really excited about it. A bunch of companies formed, kind of the things I referred to earlier. We started to see a little bit of a phase change in the Docker ecosystem itself. So what this means is that there's been less new projects being started, and we're kind of seeing things settle out. So what we see is that Kubernetes, there's sort of an ecosystem around Kubernetes and CoreOS. There is one around Docker, which is sort of more tools-based, around the Docker daemon, Swarm, Compose, and then there is a larger, sort of more varied space, which is kind of people doing more DIY stuff, where they're taking these components, some of them are for Docker Inc., and putting them together to kind of create these solutions. So you may say to yourself, like, where do I fit into this? Like, I want to do some containerized deployments, or maybe I want to use containers for isolation for CI. Like, what do I need Kubernetes, or like, do I need something different? We're going to kind of take you through the use cases here a little bit. We'll start with Kubernetes. So Kubernetes really comes out of Google's experience doing clustered at-scale deployments using cgroups wrappers. And so what they've done is they've sort of taken the technology, they've taken their knowledge, their sort of secret sauce that kind of comes from, but you may have heard of the Borg and Chubby and sort of their cluster infrastructure, and then using sort of Docker and some Go code to model this into Kubernetes. And so what it does is it gives you sort of a runtime for dividing your operational concerns from your development concerns when you're doing sort of these mini microservice type deployments. So if you have a lot of little services, you have a lot of developers, and you need a good workflow to sort of be able to separate your operational concerns, spreading this out over a lot of computing resources, like Kubernetes works very well. And so it's sort of a big solution for a specific type of problem. So let's actually kind of go into looking at how we would use Juju to deploy Kubernetes, and what we can kind of do with what the charms are there today.
Okay, I'm controlling the slides there, so you want me to is Matt, just tell me who's sharing. It looks like Matt.
I think it's going to be Matt. So
okay, all right.
Do you want to speak to a little bit about what we see here, Matt?
Sure. Okay, so what we have here is Kubernetes modeled in Juju, and what we're looking at is the Juju GUI, and we're looking at the four different charms for Kubernetes. First and foremost, we have the Kubernetes, which is the Kubernetes master, which is the controller node, and it has an instance of what we call minions or nodes, Kubernetes nodes. So those are the two Kubernetes charms right there. Kubernetes uses Docker in this case, so we have a Docker charm, and Kubernetes, the minion nodes are subordinates to the Docker. And then, so we use Flannel so that we can see those Docker containers outside of the host. All the Docker containers that are started on a host can see each other, but they can't see outside the host. So we use Flannel Docker charm to do that with an ECTD, kind of a database or a key value store.
Yeah, so Kubernetes uses etcd, as does Flannel Docker, so to sort of manage state within the system. So as you launch pods of containers in Kubernetes, pods are sort of a group of containers that have the need to share similar resources, therefore be launched on the same host. Basically, Kubernetes will track that by putting the information into etcd.
Yep. Yep. So this instance is running on my Amazon credentials, and the way I launched it is, let me change my screen. We're actually upstream in Kubernetes. We got a pull request landed in the Kubernetes branch in GitHub, and what I did was I had to export Kubernetes _provider equals Juju, and then I did a kube up. So cluster kube tack up .sh. And since it's already deployed, it's going to go through that again and say, okay, everything's deployed. You don't have anything that I'm going to do. But this is in the Kubernetes GitHub branch right now. You can try this out. If you don't have Amazon credentials, you can run it on Azure. You could run it on an OpenStack cloud. You just need to provide it your credentials, and you're good to go. So here it's finished because it already was deployed, and it was basically a no-op, but it had to run through everything. And my 2 minions are live here, and everything seemed to work. So that's it.
And I know we also run on bare metal. I haven't deployed this myself, so just for those of you out there that have a cluster of hardware and you really want to get that container density, right? Running it on the bare metal will probably be way awesomer than running it on VMs, right?
Yeah, we would love to hear from you. Like we haven't actually had a chance to try this on a NAS cluster, but I think that's a very interesting application. And this gives you, so you actually have sort of a Google-like clustering infrastructure on Metal would be pretty rad. So if you guys try that, we'd love to hear from you. So you saw a little bit from Matt there about how we've upstreamed the charms into Kubernetes, and basically if you were launching Kubernetes, they have a directory on the Kubernetes project that allows a bunch of different provisioning methods, and they all use that kube up and kube down. So you can sort of use that idiomatically. We also provide a bundle, so if you want to tweak the settings and tweak your placement and all that kind of stuff, you can do that too. So when we were looking at the stack there, we saw sort of a common set of components that we kind of see as a general pattern throughout the Docker space, which is you have an orchestrator in the form of Kubernetes, which sort of determines where containers go on the various hosts. It sort of does some coordination when you launch containers. We have an SDN, which basically allows you to map the networking to all those containers, which is a general problem you may run into when you're working with Docker. And then we have the runtime, which is Docker itself. So this week, CoreOS actually announced that CoreOS and Google announced that they've worked on that they are about to release integration for Kubernetes for Rocket. So we hope to very soon be able to swap out, and maybe somebody out there has a use case for this would like to help us with this charm, is to be able to swap out the Docker runtime for a Rocket runtime for Kubernetes. And that's really, that in itself is a microcosm of what we're trying to do here. There are lots of pieces, parts, there are lots of similar patterns, and what we're trying to do with Juju is to provide you normal ways so you can switch in and out the pieces that you need as you build something for your use case. I think the use case with Kubernetes is probably if you are looking at if you are a small operator and you are looking at building out a simple CI pipeline, or maybe a sort of your tiered stepwise delivery pipeline toward production, where you have staging, production, production. Using Kubernetes might be heavier than you need at this point, and you might actually want to go with more of a component-based approach. And so I think Chuck has been working on some more like kind of some things that for people who are sort of more interested in like, hey, I know exactly what components I want to use. He's actually been working on a fairly interesting project and published a blog today about actually doing a very simple continuous delivery workflow with using Docker and our charms. So can you speak to that, Chuck? Or you
bet, Whit. Thank you for the introduction. And I kind of want to pull this back just a little bit to kind of cover some of what's already here. We did see the formation on the GUI of what the Kubernetes cluster gives you. And this is actually built upon a foundation of just this charm here for the Docker charm that's illustrated in the Docker core bundle. And as we can see here, we've got decomposable and interchangeable pieces, and that was kind of a core tenet behind designing the Docker charm and this core set of infrastructure so that each and every one of these components can be changed out with something else. So if you don't want to use Flannel and you've already got experience in another networking provider, you can plug that right in, and you've gained that. You've gained really the raw power of Juju and the relationship model to kind of set these up. And I've also had some people question me over the last 4 to 5 months over what exactly just a Docker charm gives you, because it's just a glorified apt-get install, right? Well, that sounds kind of like upfront about what it's really doing. There's a lot of complexity that's hidden in this by the fact that it's also exposing the ability to relate to these software-defined networks or storage providers or third-party services that you can bake right into this charm and gain that integration for free. So while, yes, at face value, it's just apt-get installing an application, you've also exposed a lot of new functionality to this. And with the, I'm going to say that within the next month to month and a half, I'm going to start landing actions against this charm that will help in managing a single Docker host. And we'll start looking at how this looks in clustering situations and what other actions we can apply that will help you there. And if you're not familiar with what Juju actions are, think of it like this. If you're going to Juju SSH to a unit, you would instead invoke an action against the charm, and that gives you repeatable results consistently. So since we've looked at the Docker core bundle...
Hey, can I stop you right here? Because I think the actions thing is kind of interesting. I'd like to point out that, like, we have learned a lot about Docker working on this, but we do not know as much as everybody else. And all of you people out there, when you're working on these things, one of the cool things about the Docker charm is it's an open source project, it's in GitHub, and a great way to contribute is if you have something that you do all the time with Docker, like, say, cleaning up images every so often, or backing up your data containers. Like, these are all great things to be encapsulated in action. We would love your contributions. So, go ahead, Chuck.
Plus 1,000 to that sentiment, Whit. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so we've looked at the Docker core bundle, and now I kind of want to expose what you can actually do with that. For the few people that have approached me and said, what exactly does this give me? And I've kind of replied with, the world is your oyster. I set out this last Sunday to kind of build an ecosystem on top of this, just kind of riffing and getting out the duct tape and putting on my Charmer's hat, and building something interesting to me. And what I really enjoy looking at whenever I'm looking at a deployment topology is figuring out how this would relate to a build pipeline, because most developers that I interact with on a day-to-day basis are working in some kind of CI system, and they need to get their production to run through QA and execute tests, and they need to do this continuously so that way they can iterate fast. And whenever you're working with Docker containers, you've got a few artifacts that you can leverage to do this, such as a Docker file, which is going to allow you to repeatedly build a container, and by just executing a set of instructions. It's a lot like the Docker side of configuration management. And Juju can consume this and use that for the delivery mechanism, and I can then bake in additional intelligence. So what this kind of a mess of charms on the screen is illustrating here is that I have 3 layers that I'm looking at. At the very bottom of the layer, I have my container infrastructure. I've got the Docker charm here, which is obviously providing my Docker runtime. But then above that, I wrote a charm called the Docker build hook. So for me, I have kind of a GitHub workflow personally, and what I like to do is whenever I make a commit on my master branch of my GitHub repository, I want that to be running somewhere. I want that to either go off into CI and kick off a test process, or I also want this to go into my staging environment so I can immediately start interacting with that service that I've got deployed. While I can do this locally on my laptop, I would also like to maintain a high feature parity with my production environment. And this kind of exposes that to me by doing something a little interesting, setting up an API that's going to integrate with GitHub. And whenever I click on my Docker charm, I just want to pull out the public address here and navigate to port 8080 on this service. And what this is going to tell me is that I've got a web service running underneath this charm that's telling me that I've got these particular projects registered in it. And I'd also like to note that I didn't have to do anything to actually register these. This is a charm relationship integration. I was able to model my build process in these charms. So what this is telling me is I have separate hooks set up for different repositories. Each one of these JSON objects represents a project. It tells me that it's going to execute this command against this repository when GitHub pings my server and says, "Hey, I've got this new commit. If you need to take an action, go ahead and take one." So to step up the layer just a little bit, I've got this Docker file charm that I set. And through configuration, I tell it what I want it to build. It's a relative path off of the base repository. Just tell it what script to execute. I tell it where I want it to live on the file system. And then additionally, I tell it which repository it should be pulling from. So whenever you first deploy this, you co-locate this on your Docker host. It git clones that repository. You add a project relationship to the Docker build hook. It registers this project in that API, and then it's going to run an initial build. So there's also a little bit of intelligence baked into the Docker build hook with an additional Python script that once the GitHub API has pinged this with a post-commit webhook, it's going to update the repository. It's going to rebuild my project from the specified build script, and if the build succeeds, it will take action. If it does not, it no-ops, and the running container is going to continue to run in my Docker infrastructure. However, if that build succeeds, it's going to nuke the existing container, and it's going to cycle it out with a brand new container. So this all happens right around from the time that it's finished building to cycling up the new Docker container is right around sub 1 second downtime, which is a pretty decent deployment mechanism for a staging environment. There's a lot of other things that you could do here, and there's a lot of other projects that have tackled this problem. But I wanted to do this in a Juju representation and kind of illustrate how we can innovate in this space and continue to work and consume existing Juju services. I further illustrate that with a Logspot charm that I wrote. And Logspot is an interesting application that was written by Container HQ, I believe, or Glider Labs.
That was written by Glider Labs. It's
thank
part
you.
of it, yeah.
And Glider Labs needed to do logging infrastructure, and Logspot basically hooks in to the Docker API and starts collecting logs.
So this is it's worth pointing out here that if you're working with Docker, this is a basic problem that you have. Is like, where do your logs go? And there are commands built into the Docker command that allow you to do that, and I think possibly with Swarm you may be actually able to get collected logs. But in general, routing the standard output that comes from the command that is launched when you launch the container is kind of a general problem. And so Logspot does a great job of kind of making this pluggable. It listens to the events that the Docker daemon emits and basically gives you a way to get structured logging back out of Docker itself. So they're kind of Heka can do this, but Logspot is very Docker specific and kind of nice, concise, single purpose tool.
Very true. And the nice part about this is that our Elk stack is already charmed up and available in the charm store. So I got this level of integration for free by writing a single charm. And I'm just going to pull up the Kibana dashboard, which is the front-end dashboard service to the Elk stack, and just show a quick kind of grep through the logs of what's available in here. So if I pipe in here into log/search and I choose Docker, I see that I have got logs that are being emitted directly from my Docker host, and I can track these as a kind of a time series database. I can run additional queries through this. So for example, I'm running a Telegram bot that goes by the name of Octobot, and I want to find every single message that has been emitted from that Docker container. So I'm just going to search for Octobot, and I'm going to execute this query, and this stacked bar chart tells me that most of my Docker emitted logs are actually coming from this Telegram bot, which is kind of nice. So this gives me a centralized logging infrastructure, and again, I got this for free just by doing the integration.
It's worth noting there that you get, you can run your Docker logs in there, and you can run all your other logs too. So
correct.
That sort of being able to plug both the Docker world and the non-Docker world together is one of the things that we're seeing as being pretty nice about this.
Just as a side note, which we'd already noted that I published a blog post about this about 10 minutes before we went on air. This is reposted on planet.ubuntu.com. So if you're curious about the actual breakdown and some of the methodology in this, I've got a really good write-up. So grab a coffee and enjoy that read. All right, that covers most of what I had to talk about regarding that quick stack. I would also like to note that those are all concept charms. They're not production ready in any way. I literally prototyped this over a weekend, so it was more proof of concept ware. And if there's a lot of interest in that, I'm more than happy to continue developing on that and kind of folding that into our full ecosystem play and making that a little more friendly with CI servers.
You've got those in GitHub, though, right? So people can find them, learn
from places. They're in the charm store underneath my namespace, and they're also
okay. Oh, right on. Cool. So people can launch them that way too. Awesome. Well, let's see. Where should we go from here? So we've kind of covered your pieces, parts, like how as a smaller operator you might approach some of the general problems you might see. We've looked at Kubernetes, which is a good solution for sort of bigger stuff. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what we're going to be working on next.
Okay.
That's all good. So, kind of coming into, we're going to start, and we're actually looking for help here. So if you're working with containers, maybe you're working with a different container runtime, which would be sort of interesting, or maybe you're working with some of these other components. We are actually looking to add more pieces that can be interchanged and charm them up so people can have more parts to work with. Some of the things that we're going to be starting to charm pretty soon are Daku, which is a small bash-based pass for Docker, which lets you run Heroku build packs. Basically, it's a small pass that uses Docker to run Heroku build packs. We are going to charm up we actually have a charm already for Consul, which some of you guys may know, which is Consul does a lot of stuff, but it's from HashiCorp. It allows you to do service discovery and also works as a key value store. This would actually provide an alternative for people who want to do some things that are similar to etcd, but maybe slightly differently. We're going to hopefully get Flocker, which will allow you to do storage manipulation. So that means you can move a container from one host to another, data containers, running containers. And we're also looking at Weave and Calico to kind of get some more options other than just Flannel for doing software-defined networking. We also have a it's not quite production ready, but I'd love to have you guys try it out, a Swarm charm. Swarm, as you guys may or may not know, is from Docker. It's Docker Inc. itself. It's an open source project. It allows you to do basically kind of have a Docker-like command line that actually talks to multiple hosts instead of a single one. So it lets you run Docker run, Docker image, Docker PS across multiple hosts at the same time. So we've actually implemented this. I'm sorry, unfortunately my screen share is not working, but we've actually implemented this as a subordinate to the Docker charm itself. And so we're kind of interested in actually adding some actions there so there's the link and the instructions on how to use it.
And you got your first question.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Has there been tests to use Juju with CRIU? CRIU? I don't know how people say that. To live migrate Docker containers to other servers.
So that's kind of what you would use. I do not know what CRIU is. Do Matt or Chuck, do you guys?
Unfortunately, I don't. I do know that kind of functionality was something that I was looking at in Flocker. It's one of their advertised features that allows you to migrate containers and data containers as well. But I am not familiar with CRIU or even the terminology there. So looks like I've got a little bit of light reading there.
Yeah.
I know we're doing it with LexD. That's what Tycho demoed. And then he moved it over. But I don't know if we're doing that with Docker.
Checkpoint restore in user space, it looks like.
Yeah, if that sounds like it could work with Docker. If it works at the cgroups layer, probably it would work for LXD and for Docker. If it works on the LXC layer, it may require some work to actually do that. But yeah, that's something we'd actually be really interested in, because that's right now one of the challenges that we're looking at with charming Flocker is Flocker actually requires ZFS, which makes it a little bit more tricky to get a charm working with it. So it would be great to have a native option to do that. So yeah, great question. Thanks. We learned something. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I know with LexD you can do live migration, but that we don't model that yet in Juju yet, so I'm assuming we don't do that in Docker.
Yeah.
So once we do it for LexD, it'll be trivial to enable Docker to do the same.
Yeah, and that's sort of like we are looking forward to, and LexD is will pretty soon be at a point where we can kind of start looking at using LXD as one of those interchangeable runtimes, depending on its support for various different container formats. So, and then once we do that, obviously we would. I mean, most container formats are not very complex. Like, you basically have a file system and you have a little bit of metadata with it that sort of tells the runner how this is going to come up, what process to start. So, like, you can export a Docker container and run it in Rocket without much problem. And I imagine we probably aren't too far from being able to do that with LXD. So that's kind of one of those things where you're like, well, I use my Docker file as sort of my build process, and then I can run my container in Rocket because I like its operational characteristics better. And this is sort of kind of what we're aiming at providing. It's like we want to be able to let you make the choices you need to make. You need to use a Docker registry and a Docker build workflow for your CI and development, but you want to use Rocket or LXD as your production. That's what we are working towards, and that would be awesome. Like being it, like Flocker or this CRIU thing, like that. Those are sort of that's sort of where the tire hits the road with actual production, because actually being able to back up containers and being able to roll back, roll forward, and recover will be very important. So let's see, where were we?
Let me pull up the Venn diagram again. 1 second. That'll help as a really good frame of reference. Okay. So I think another thing that's interesting to note here is that there's three specific camps that we see that have kind of emerged that have got a lot of buy-in and following. Is that we've got Kubernetes here, we've got the Docker Inc. tooling, which we're looking at getting charmed up is what's already started with the Swarm subordinate, and there's also the kind of do-it-yourself and smaller vendors. And what's really interesting is that the DIY crowd, I'm seeing quite a bit of innovation come out of, specifically with the tooling like Doku and Flocker.
Well, Glider Labs is a great example with Registrator, Doku. What were they? There's like Logspot. Like they've kind of consistently, and I think that they've actually worked with a lot of larger projects to kind of provide these different pieces. Like currently, their work on Registrator is being funded by Weave. I think their current work on Doku has been funded by Dace, parent company. So, and then there are other tool makers out there, but that's sort of where we're seeing a lot of new and different stuff come out, where we see sort of Swarm, that we see sort of the stuff around Docker Inc. and the stuff around Kubernetes are sort of more big players piling in. So it's kind of a different dynamic.
Right. That's so many words what I was trying to say. Very eloquently put, Whit.
Well, I didn't mean to change you there. So we could talk about a little bit. So if you are somebody out there and you're like, all right, I've got an application, and I kind of understand the pieces part that I need to solve my problem, but I actually have an application that I'm using a Docker workflow or some type of container-based workflow. Maybe it's Docker, maybe it's sort of more image-based. How do I actually turn that into a working charm? How do I make that play with all this good stuff?
All right, was that a prompt for me, Whit?
That was a prompt for you, Chuck.
All right, I'm sorry I dropped the ball here. 1 second. Let me get my terminal up here, make sure I've got...
Anyway, that was sort of a leading question for Chuck, because Chuck is actually, well, as we saw with the little demo that he gave us of his sort of how you would do CI/CD with Docker and Juju, but I think he's got a little bit of a demo to kind of walk us through how you would make a Dockerized charm.
All right, so I am going to do something that I don't necessarily recommend, and I'm just going to prototype in Bash. Because for me, it's hyper simple and quick to go to run through. I don't require any additional dependencies on the host. So let me just start off by doing a charm create tag bash. Now, this charm create command is available once you have charm tools installed, which is installed via apt-get install charm tag tools. And let's just call this an Nginx website Docker charm. All right, so I'm going to come into this, and I'm going to tree tag L2. And we just see that we've got a basic charm scaffolding that we've created. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to edit my metadata to go ahead and tell Juju exactly what I'm going to be deploying here. I'm going to skip a lot of the top metadata, and I'm going to come right down here and state that I know that I'm going to be deploying a website. So I'm going to say that this provides the relationship of a website over the HTTP interface. And I want to do this so that way I can get HA proxy right out of the gate and get a charm relationship that's going to exist in the Juju ecosystem already, and just kind of capitalize on that. The next step for me is going to be editing the configuration file and setting a few different options. So whenever I sit down to charm, I first kind of sketch out what I want the charm to do and what my prerequisites are for that service pool. So I'm going to say that I've got a repository option, and I'm going to default this to a repository that I've got bookmarked. Just for ease of use, that way I don't have to set it whenever I deploy it during this quick demo. And I'm going to go ahead and just say that there's no description because I'm special. And I'm going to get rid of that Boolean option, and I want to set a port option. So I'm going to set port because we all know that web servers require a port in order to communicate. I'm going to default this to port 8000. I'm going to write it, and I'm going to go ahead and quit out of this.
Wait, Chuck.
You got some typo there.
Yeah, you got a typo in the default value.
Oh, thank you. That would have been disastrous.
Before we jump too far down here, I mean, Chuck is, I think for this charming task, just kind of demonstration bash. One of the nice things about kind of the ergonomics of using Docker is a lot of things become very simple once you've encapsulated all your installed steps into the Docker file. You've separated out your build from your deploy, and the deploy becomes pretty simple. It's basically a Docker run, your environment options that you need to pass in, and those are sort of predetermined by how you've built your image to begin with. So Bash may actually be, if you're doing simple things, Bash may be great. Another pattern that we've often found works pretty well is using the service framework, because that whole, do I have the information I need to run? Now I do have the information I need to run, then it would run a Docker run command. And so there's actually a Rethink DB charm that's out there that is a good demonstration of how you would use Docker and the services framework to model sort of basically the very simple, am I blocked? Do I need more information? Am I ready to run? And I think it's worth noting that there are sort of different approaches depending on what your application is going to need to do and what kind of information you need to feed into the launching command for the container.
Very true. And I don't mean to misrepresent Bash as a helpful tool in leveraging and charming. I just find that once you start getting into larger projects, that the complexity of maintaining a Bash charm can oftentimes be cumbersome. But since what we're doing here is very simple, I think that Bash is a great option, especially for prototyping. If you just want to get moving really quickly, that's typically what I reach for right off the shelf. Just start writing a Bash charm, kind of feel out how it should work, and then once I feel that the concept is matured, I'll start porting it into a configuration management tool set.
Also, if you're modeling, basically, if your system is a bunch of microservices, you may not need much more than that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, for example, the Docker file charm is 100% Bash, and I did that on purpose because I wanted to keep it lightweight. I didn't want to have the overhead of a CM toolkit over top of it, because all I'm doing is cloning a repository and sending data over the wire. It does nothing other than that. So, since we're not going to be kind of consuming the Docker relationship, we don't want to write this as a subordinate. Let's go ahead and assume that this is going to be a standalone charm, and this is just going to be Juju deployable and work as we expect it to. So I'm going to edit my install hook. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to apt-get install my predependencies. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say set tech EU, because I am a good Bash programmer and I don't want to have a runaway hook. I'm going to install docker.io right from repository, no PPA added. I'm going to also install git. and at which point my predependencies have been met. This is going to cover all the functionality that I need. So I'm going to right quit that. I'm going to edit now the configuration changed hook. And if I could vim, I would be all right. All right. So let's stop for a minute and think about exactly what we have coming in here. We've got 2 configuration options that we need to action on, and we need to make sure that we update this whenever we do an application set. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say my project, which is my repository configuration option, is going to be equal to config get repository. And the next step, I also want to set my project directory as a local variable. So I'm going to say project dir equals, and I'm going to do a little bit of bash foo here. I'm going to say echo my project variable, and I want to run this through awk, and I'm going to split that out on forward slashes, and I only want to capture the 5th line of this output. So I'm going to say print 5. I'm going to close out that bash directive, and I'm going to say after equals /tmp/projectdir. So what I've done here is I've fetched a configuration variable. I've trimmed the string to just give me the very last bit. So and to give an example, in my configuration.yaml, I have this particular repository here, and this is going to print out just this choicepools v3.get, which that's where it's going to actually place the files that it's cloning from Git. So jumping back into my application logic, I also want to guard against having an empty value. So I'm going to check for that, and I'm going to say that if I do not have a value for app.dir, then I want to clone this, else, and this is an app path, this is app.dir. I also didn't check for if it's empty. So pardon my scatterbrained, I am in the zone. I want to echo out to my log file that no configuration for repository doing nothing, and I'm going to exit 0. I'm going to get rid of that typo, and I'm going to come back down into this logic block. So this logic block that I've got here is guarding against the empty configuration file, and the charm will exit, it will no op, until I have a configuration value set. The next thing I want to do is I know that I'm going to clone something, and a git clone will error out if I attempt to clone it twice to the same directory. And I don't want to have this intermediate error. So the first thing I need to do is I need to check if the application directory is there. If it's not, then I want to actually clone this repository. Otherwise, what I want to do is I want to actually run a git update on this particular path. So I say git pull origin, and I'm just going to hard code in master. We could actually extend this charm a little bit more to receive a branch parameter. So I'm going to cd back into my charm directory, and this is a magic environment variable that's available to me within a context. The specific charm dir. The reason why I'm doing this cd is so that way I don't have to scope anything with this command. This is just for simplicity's sake, and then I go right back into the context of my charm directory. So the next step to this is I need to fetch my port variable. So I'm going to say config get port, and then in which case I'm going to do a sentinel check here to make sure that I've actually got the port variable. And echo no port configured, doing nothing, exit 0. I've got the same basic guarding logic down here that I had for my app directory, or for my project configuration value. So the next step to this is we actually want to start this. So whenever you Docker run a container, it's going to spit back the UUID of that container that's being started. And this is a great way for me to actually interact with the Docker daemon. So I'm going to say docker pid equals docker run. I want to run this in daemon mode. I want to map a host port to port 80 inside of this container. I want to volume mount my application path. So this is going to be app.dir. And I happen to know that in the Nginx container that's being distributed, that needs to be mounted to USR share Nginx HTML. I want to mount that read-only, and I'm going to scope this to the Nginx image. And then at which point I can echo this PID file out to a Docker process. And finally, I want to make sure that I open port the port that I specified in my configuration YAML. So what's interesting here is that I haven't accounted for if this Docker container is already running in the environment. So I have captured that PID. So what would be prudent is before we actually reach this block of code is we put in yet another guard, and we say if the Docker process file exists, then I want to Docker kill that particular container, cat Docker process, and then I want to remove that Sentinel file so that way if I run this again and there's not actually a Docker container running, that it doesn't reach this in error. And this is essentially all that I need in order to actually obtain a Docker-based charm. I'm going to right-quit this. I'm going to cd into hooks. I don't need to retain my start hook because I'm not doing anything in it. I don't need my stop hook. I don't need upgrade charm. And now, if I look, I see that I have all these extra relation files that I haven't actually implemented. So let's say that I have already scoped this for the HTTP relationship, which we did in metadata.yaml. And we know that it's website, so let me just bring that up to run an assertion. So we have this provide stanza, and it's providing a website relationship. So this is going to be the scoped relationship that I need to write a hook for. So I am going to rm relation star to get rid of those template files that I don't need, and I am going to edit a website relation joined. Actually, I want to do this. Yes, I want to do this in joined, and I'm going to put in a shebang. I'm going to set the same bash guards at the top, and I'm going to say relation set port equals config get port. And that's all that I need to do. And the reason why this is the only thing that I need to set is that my private address is implicitly sent over the wire with every relationship. That's just something that's inherent to the Juju ecosystem. And the other side of this is that I happen to know that HA proxy wants a port value. So I'm going to relation set this, and I'm going to right quit. And at which point, we're actually ready to deploy this charm. Let's see which environment I'm in. See if this is actually bootstrapped. All right, so let me switch to another one that's already up, and let's actually just go ahead and deploy this to that environment. One of the things that I didn't do when I started charming this is I didn't make a proper charm repository. I need to move this into that charm repository.
Say, Chuck.
Yes, sir.
Go back into your config changed hook. I think you were did some. If this is the port, go down to the port section. Wouldn't it be TACP the private address : port?
No. What this is going to do is that since I didn't specify it, this is going to bind on all interfaces.
Oh, okay, I see.
So if I wanted to bind only to my public interface, I would have to fetch that with another Juju command that is unit get public address.
Okay.
And then I would plug in the unit address to whatever I assign that to with a colon, and then it would be port, and then colon the port that I'm going to map into the Docker container. Yeah. Really good question, Matt. Thank you for asking that. The default behavior of Docker is if you don't spec it to an address or an interface, it's going to listen on all interfaces.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
All right. So now I should be able to say, oh, this is a manual provider. Let me deploy this to Juju deploy Juju status. Figure out which machines I have here. I've got machine 2. 2 does not have a service of 78,000. So Juju deploy local trusty nginx website docker repository equals relative path. I want to co-locate this on machine 2. All right, so I'm going to run a watch on this. And then I'm going to further decompose my Biobu session, and I'm just going to Juju debug log, and I want to filter out machine 0 chatter. I want to watch this install and kind of see what's going to happen. Since this machine is already provisioned, this should go right to work on installing, and we see that the agent state's already moving through, and I do see that I have a hook failed and config changed, so this is good practice for us. Juju debug hooks nginx website docker. Nginx website docker 0. Juju install TACR nginx website docker 0. This should go ahead and put me back in a config changed context on this unit. All right. right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an X trace because I want to see what's happening in this script when it fails. So I'm going to run hooks config changed. And I see that I have a variable that I referenced appdir that is not defined. And what actually happened here was I have a typo in my bash. So I'm going to write that. I'm going to write quit. I'm going to re-execute my config changed hook.
It's one of those, like, you've been writing too much Python errors.
Yeah.
So
Story of my life.
It's worth noting that the container runtimes, and I have to check on LXD's features, and I imagine Rocket will grow something similar to this, is like that the Docker run command, you can actually specify what you want the restart policy to be, and it will act very similar to the way that upstart does. So you don't actually have to manage that process with like a sysp init file or an upstart file. You can actually just tell the runtime, restart this container if it fails or if the machine is rebooted.
So I see that my config changed hook has finished running. So if I run docker ps,
you're running out of time, so pick it up.
Yeah, well,
you got it, man. This is actually the tail end of it. So if I run docker ps, I see that my container is indeed running. It's open on port 8000. So I should be able to rerun this again. Make sure that it's going to act consistently. It is going to kill my container. If I run docker ps, I should see that it's up for just a couple seconds again. It says it kicked off 3 seconds ago, and I got the same behavior that I was expecting to see. So I'm free to exit, and I'm going to be caught in a bit of a, Juju status, Nginx Docker website. Oh, it's Nginx website. Docker. George, you put the pressure on me. Uh-oh. All right. I've got this public address. Let me copy this out. I'm going to pull this right up in a browser just to run an assertion that we do actually have a website listening at the other end of this.
So that was a lot of information really quickly. Pretty amazing to watch Chuck put that together.
And we see that we've got a website that's being served through that Docker container that's mapped to the host on port 8000. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you model Docker delivery in Juju Charms in, what, 15 minutes or less?
15 minutes or less, baby.
Yeah.
Well done.
So, welcome to the Chuck Show.
Yeah. So anyway, we do the quick summary. So we've got charms for Kubernetes, a whole bunch of Docker ecosystem charms. We've got charms coming for more things in the Docker ecosystem. Come check them out. We would love to have contributions. We would love to know what you want. We would love to see actions and new hooks and new relationships added to all these charms, because that's what makes them really cool. Chuck, Matt, you got anything to add?
What I want to say, like, wholeheartedly is community members that are listening, if you are passionate about this space, even if you only have feedback, we want to talk to you.
Yeah.
We are very passionate about this as well, and we want to make this a very rich and rewarding experience for you as a developer and somebody that's shipping infrastructure as code. That's all I had.
Okay,
Cool.
That's awesome. And that's the tail end of the session. Thanks, guys. Thanks for the questions in IRC, and we'll be back in 5 minutes with Ubuntu on Power 8. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Take it easy. Thank you, George.